It's great to be joined today by Dr. Rizwan Malik, who has successfully built his profile as an authoritative commentator in health and care. Rizwan is a consultant radiologist at the Royal Bolton NHS Foundation Trust, where he's a divisional medical director and also associate chief clinical information officer. He is a clinical lead in a Greater Manchester-wide informatics program and also provides consultancy to health technology providers. And additionally, he's a member of the Highland Marketing Advisory Board as well. So Rizwan, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your career?
Thank you for the invitation, Matthew. The clinical and hospital aspects, I think you very nicely covered off already. I suppose in terms of reference to what we're talking about today, I can point to headache, a cup of coffee, and two very nice people who really were gateways for me to doing what it was. And it was, if we go back a sort of decade, the tradition within the NHS in particular, and it really does seem to be, speaking to colleagues around the world, a mindset which we have here, is this separation between the hospital and the supplier community, and never the twain shall meet, other than, you know, supplying of sandwiches for ward meetings and things like this. And there was always this perception of selling out. And I think that embedded so strongly that it meant that the supplier community didn't really engage with doctors, and certainly, you know, not quite the same with drug reps back when I was training, and even that seems to have tailed off. But within radiology in particular, the majority of discussions were with PACS managers, with radiographers, and we were never really involved in any of the dialogue. And I found it increasingly strange, having started training at a time when PACS was still relatively new, the way we used it evolved, and yet it always seemed a little bit odd that we're using very, very expensive machines, incredibly expensive software, and I always felt I was having to juggle or tweak or compromise what I was doing, and it was getting more and more frustrated with that, if I'm honest. You'd go to conferences, and again, the mindset was, well, there's no point talking to these lot. It's not as if any view I had would affect anything. And, you know, you're only ever going to see the best in a very artificial environment. Q said headache and said coffee. One such conference, I walked past it, as it happened, it was the Fuji stand, and I got approached by Kevin Shah, who's a great bloke, you know, and he just asked if I wanted to chat about all things PACS and imaging. And for a change, rather than giving him the usual "no way, Jose," I said, "Spot me a coffee and fine." And we then had, you know, to this day, it was well over 15 years ago. I remember that conversation because he did nothing more than ask me my views on imaging and my frustrations, what I liked, what I didn't like. And it was at one stage when he started laughing at me, or laughing with me, however you want to look at it, which really gave me pause, because he pointed out that some of the frustrations I've had have been dealt with by not just his company, but by imaging suppliers across the board. And, well, you know, if I'd have spoken before, I'd know more about what was going on. And then we got into, well, why didn't I know what was going on? Because no one seems to want to talk to me, not me personally, but with us as radiologists. And that sparked a whole train of conversation itself of why there's this disconnect. Around the same time, again, I was very privileged that our CIO at the time, Rachel Dunscombe, again, we had a couple of throwaway conversations. At the time, she found in me someone who had an interest in tech, and just basically unleashed me to go and do some research for her. And it might sound strange to be a post-fellowship consultant, but I almost felt like I was given permission to pursue my interests. The third piece of that jigsaw was LinkedIn. I discovered that, and it gave me a platform sometimes, nothing else at the start with, was just to share some of my views, my thoughts, almost like a blog. There was no direction, there was no particular aim for them. It was an invitation to have conversations in a safe online platform. And to my mind, what I was doing is I was covering off this "thou shalt not engage with suppliers," because, heck, it's online, the world is looking, and there can be no question of impropriety in that sort of environment. And then what I found was actually, contrary to what I thought, sales specialists and informatics specialists actually quite liked the idea of talking to a clinician who wanted to engage with them.
So I think from there, Rizwan, you've gone on to become a well-known speaker, somebody who regularly posts on social media, and somebody who's very well known in the sector now as an expert, if you like, within diagnostics, within radiology, technology, artificial intelligence, and the list could probably go on. What would be your advice to people who want to raise their own profile now?
So what I've tended to find, certainly over the past 18 months, is everybody wants a quick fix and everyone wants to be well regarded instantly. Ignore that mindset would be the first piece. This was a 7, 8, probably a decade long, it wasn't even a project. I didn't set out to be any of these things. I just wanted to engage with an interest of mine and enjoyed people who would have the conversations with me. Sometimes, often, clearly, they were impertinent questions. Sometimes there were questions which people had at the back of their mind, but they didn't dare ask. And well, I stepped up to ask them or challenge back against them. And so to go back to people who want to do this, I think just one is have something interesting to say and share it. Don't have an output of you want to be well regarded, you want to be shared, you don't chase the likes, just change interesting conversation. And eventually what you do is you'll find people either like or dislike what you say, which in turn makes them interact with you. And over the course of the days, weeks, and months, when something comes up in someone else's mind, they might want your take on it. And so you'll find yourself being drawn into more and more conversations. Conversely, when you see something out in the wild and you have a view on it and you share it, people who've engaged with you in the past are more likely to want to see what you have to say about it. And that's when, the views go from the tens to the hundreds to the thousands in a steady course. It's almost like, the Instagram where you can pay for followers. The quick fix routine always tails off. And actually, I think it's sometimes become very easy to say those who are posting for the attraction, attention, and those who really have something interesting to say.
And that's fascinating. And I think with that, you clearly had the confidence to do this. And I think you touched on the fact that there were some people that helped to give you that confidence or helped to get you on the track of being a commentator. Do you think people more widely in health and care should have greater confidence to discuss things that they're involved in, to contribute to the debate? And do you think to an extent we need a culture change within the health and care environment to enable that?
Absolutely, we do. So I feel I'm very fortunate because I happen to engage with some very nice people, and they are of the similar mindset to me in that there is a big cake, we can all partake on it. Where the problems arise and where the culture shift is, people try to monetize these kinds of profiles. And if they do that, the last thing they want to do is share that spotlight or share that stage with anybody else, because all that may well take away from the pound, shilling and pence that comes to me. That in itself is something which we need to change. If your mindset is you want to be interesting within a domain, well, growing somebody else's profile alongside you, I personally feel, is far more seductive and far more powerful than the me aspect of it. And it also gives you a way to bounce ideas off people. Don't be afraid of finding colleagues or juniors who have similar interests and feel you can mentor them. And this is where you get into the whole, who the heck am I? No one really cares what I think. That is a self-mindset change as well. Don't think of it in such black and white terms. Think of it as abstract. If someone's asked you for input and advice, be proud of the fact that someone feels enough about you to do that, and just play with a straight bat. One thing I've really found actually is that it's far easier to gain a profile externally than it is within your own workplaces. And the culture change really has to change there. There are, and I found a similar experience with many of my colleagues who do this, that they'll be jetting around the world to international conferences, and yet they have very limited roles in their own workplace because they, either they don't particularly have people don't like the gobbin so-and-so who always rocks up to meetings and rocks the boat. They don't fit with that particular culture within their department, within their division, within their hospital. So there needs to be some encouragement of a variety and diversity of thought, and to actually give more attention to promoting those kind of individuals who do want to progressing, these non-standard portfolio career paths.
So that's fascinating, Rizwan, that you picked up on that internal versus external approach, I suppose you might label it as. With that internal approach to raising your profile, to having that element of communication, what sort of things are important to do? Is this a case of engaging with the more formal internal channels that you might find exist within a trust or within an NHS organisation, or as we increasingly move towards regionalised integrated care systems within a region, or is this the more informal channels as well?
I think your mileage may vary here. Probably the biggest blocker to this is the innate resistance on both sides of self-promotion and how that can come across, even though you might not necessarily feel you're self-promoting. Anyone who even talks about you, it gets, the reception can sometimes be very negative. And this is why I think the clinical community in particular is very poor at engaging, because they don't like talking about what they've done, not because they have any issues with what it is they're talking about, but the fear of how it will come across, the fear of how it will land within your peers, with colleagues. And that's because there has been a rather toxic culture, not necessarily negative, but not a nurturing culture. That's going to take a while to get over. And in that regard, it's always been easier sometimes to have the conversations externally. It's the whole keyboard warrior thing. When you don't care about who's paying attention, when you're not looking them in the eye, you can be a bit more free to express yourself. Whereas when it is your own thing, particularly if you're saying things which aren't the norm or might be a little bit controversial, you moderate what you say. And if you do that, of course, who the heck's actually going to understand that you do have a voice, and who's going to reach out and include you in that path? We still have a very siloed approach to this internally, which we need to find a way out of.
Is that something that we need to? We touched on culture change earlier as that being a requirement. Is this something that people need to be brave to overcome? They need to be able to say things that might potentially have that risk of negative perception, or how can this work?
I think one aspect might be just we need to allow a platform to allow people to pursue these conversations and these career paths. Encourage people who don't necessarily set out to be leaders or have in their own mindset that there will be an authority in anyone's space. Give them the opportunity to engage, because we always like pigeonholing titles and, you'll have a lead for this and a head of this. Well, if you've got a lead who's usually someone quite senior, who's usually got the right academic inputs, they may not necessarily be the right person for that particular task, but it inhibits other people engaging and coming on board, because you know what? You're only paid for X hours of a person's time or X hours of a department's time. So perhaps having a better system where you're nurturing people to be able to engage, to dabble, to try stuff, maybe the way forward. And of course, we're also busy. The last thing you want to do is to risk wasting time as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, taking a broomstick and making wholesale changes or something. A succession of small micro changes just to empower people a little bit, to allow them to speak up. And when they do, pay attention to your colleagues and pay attention to your peers. And when you know someone happens to have a thought, well, then be brave enough to go to them and seek their opinion. You don't lose anything by approaching a healthcare assistant or approaching a nursing assistant who you've known has said something interesting or has sparked a thought to you in the past, to ask them what their thoughts about new stuff going on. You sometimes probably won't even know just how empowering that engagement you're having with them can be for them.
That's great, Rizwan. And I think moving beyond to the external communication side of things, one of the things that you do a lot is presenting at conferences, at virtual events, at webinars. How have you got about achieving that?
Again, a journey of 1,000 miles and all that, really. So I started actually by feeding back to a couple of the conferences I went to and sharing my thoughts on why I thought they might be able to do better in certain things and how they might do better in certain things. Now, frankly, I was bored of listening to the same old stuff, if I may. And there were 2 or 3 who decided to try and call my bluff on it and say, well, all right, if that's what you think, what would you do differently? And don't tell us, show us. And so I got invited to take part in putting some talks together, being invited to give them from that standpoint. And then part of it, again, it goes back to what I said earlier. People should want to change who they invite, not because they want the professor of this and the world authority of this. To look around, and I think we're seeing more of that now. And it certainly was different 5 years ago. Previously, it was more important to have a title giving a topic. Now we have, because there are so many conferences, you can't have the same person give the same talk every 3 weeks. So it almost became, because you had to diversify your speakers, you had to go about and pull in more people. And how would you do that? Well, Rizwan said something a bit quirky about this topic, so let's ask him if he'd be able to give a talk on it. And it started off with those kind of conversations. Initially, I was very reluctant. It was, I'm a medic from a DGH. What am I going to do on that kind of platform? Then you eventually get asked a few times. You build up confidence, you gird your loins and have a go and realize, do you know what? The world didn't end and monsters didn't gobble you up when you did it. But because I didn't set out to thrust myself into people's faces and say, I've got something to say, listen to me, give me a stage, it grew organically. Whereas, we certainly won't name names here, but I do know a couple of colleagues who, they were desperate to, I've got something to say and I want everyone to hear what I say. When you go around it that way, it comes across in a way which isn't particularly appealing. So again, look at the long game. If this is something you want to do, you can have short-term gains. It probably will be like a match. It'll be fiery for a short time, you'll go out. But just, regularly have something interesting to say, put it out there. Not because you want people necessarily, it'd be about wanting people to engage with it, but because you really think it's interesting to you. And when you think it's interesting to you, you'll write it with a bit of passion that will reflect to other people.
And presumably, Rizwan, that extends to your reach on social media or other media as well, perhaps.
Yes. So I'll give you a case in point. Why I think is my sort of magnus opus with artificial intelligence, for example. I wrote it 2 years ago. I'd had 18 months of looking around this space, feeling a bit disillusioned. And then so my thought was, all right, what would I do then? If I were God Emperor of artificial intelligence and imaging, what did I think good looked like? And I wrote about it and I posted it and no one really paid attention. And I got frustrated and disappointed about it, but it was there, it was done, and I moved on. But the value of that, you see, was when other conversations caught up, you can then engage and reference back to something you'd said, rather than just trying to reshare and re-promote the piece of work. It's done, you've posted it. And actually, it was then someone who shared my article back to me 9 months later, because they'd read enough of some of the points I'd made on the topic to want to seek out what else has he said, and read it and then thought, oh, look, you've said things which I either agree or disagree with. Well, what do you think about this thing you've said versus that? And I think if you have the patience, it makes it easier. I suppose the other point is understanding the platforms that you're using as well. So there really are people who I admire. Dr. Vikas Shah, he's a radiologist, expert in the teaching domain. He knows how to use social media and he knows how to leverage all the different platforms very well. I use them in different ways. LinkedIn was my platform of choice. Twitter now seems to have taken on a whole medical Twitter life of its own. And so I use it for more than just shouting at salespeople when my utilities don't work, which is what I was only ever done for before. Facebook, that's for keeping in touch with family members. Instagram, again, initially it was me sharing pictures of my food and my flowers, but increasingly you find that it's being used as a teaching and education platform, so I'm using it a bit more professionally as well, but all in slightly different defined ways. And I guess in that point of view, what you also need to start understanding is how the algorithms work. Let's take LinkedIn for an example. Writing something new gains far more attention than resharing something or sharing a photo or sharing a comic strip, because, and this is my interpretation, I may be wrong, it seems the algorithm prioritizes new content. So if you read something, by all means, reshare it because you want to get it out there for other people to see. You're probably not going to get many views for other people doing it based on that. So instead, if you've seen something that really interests you, write about it in your words, write about the impacts of it, how you think it'd go. You'll probably get more attention and traction and engagement just from the algorithms that way.
Now, that's really useful advice, Rizwan. Thank you for that. And then just thinking about the other channels that are out there, which of the channels do you find most effective? Is it talking to the press? What might that be?
I think talking to the press is probably the one that still gives me the most anxiety, because those are direct one-to-one conversations and you don't have any control over the output. Writing on a platform, when it's your views and they're going to be reshared, they're your words in the way you want them to go out. I think doing this in earnest, it's probably easy to tell who has had social media training and who hasn't. I haven't. And when they're interviewed, one or two of my friends are forever on the BBC. I'm interviewed by journalists for newspapers as well, and their approach to it is something which I admire. It's being able to deal with the curveballs, because you may well have a view of something just because it's interesting to you might not be the interesting aspects of the news story to the journalists you're speaking to. So going back to what can we do within a hospital or a work culture, for example, rather than social media is bad and all these kind of things are bad, is what can we do to train our workers to just be a bit more savvy so they can use these platforms in a bit more of an effective manner.
That's really helpful advice, Rizwan. Thank you. And I think just going back to one idea that you started with, I think at the beginning of this conversation, was the idea of engaging with suppliers, with industry partners. Do you think we in the NHS, or people in the NHS and social care perhaps as well, need to think about moving away from a certain stigma that might be attached to that? Is there an opportunity to collaborate with suppliers in getting your message out there?
There is. And I have to say, I found this a really interesting piece, because in the past, I always thought it was one-way traffic, the public sector being standoffish from the supply community and this whole selling out and all that. It's just as bad the other way around as well. And so the stigmas need to be broken down on both sides, because what you'll find is if you have engagement with one or other supplier within any one domain, all of a sudden people who you'd been talking to just as freely previously will back off. And it seems that some might feel you're incapable of having intellectual conversations without being commercially bought in across the board. We definitely do. And so let me take UKIO as an example, something which I think we as a conference are quite proud of in our approach to this. One thing which we did in the way we had education was actually asking industry experts to come and talk. And guess what? You'll find people who really, really know what they're talking about are actually really good at talking about the specialist topic without making it a sales pitch all the time. And so just think that's an untapped element of the workforce as well. When you do that, then it allows you to have a, for want of a better word, expert to expert or interested party to interesting party conversation. So I think we're breaking down the barriers, but there is a way to go. But the bit I would say is it cuts both ways. And I think it needs commercial organizations as well to realize that it's perfectly possible to have conversations without, someone selling your trade secrets to another party just because you're having open, honest discussions.
Rizwan, thank you so much for your time today. I'm sure people watching this will find it a really useful insight into what you can do to start to contribute to some of the conversations that are out there. Thank you very much for your time.